There are moments in history when hunger speaks louder than ideology. In December 1945, in the ruined city of Aachen, American soldiers witnessed something that no military briefing had prepared them for. German children with hollow eyes and skeletal frames gathering near supply depots not to beg, but simply to watch. What began as routine occupation duty became a moral reckoning that would challenge everything these young men believed about enemies, war, and humanity itself. The war had ended 7 months earlier, but the suffering had not. The Allied bombing campaigns had reduced German cities to landscapes of rubble and ash. The infrastructure that once fed a nation, railways, factories, farms, lay in ruins. The winter of 1945 was shaping up to be one of the coldest in decades, and the German civilian population faced a silent enemy more merciless than any army: starvation. In Aachen, the first German city to fall to Allied forces, the contrast was stark. American soldiers had access to full rations, canned meat, chocolate bars, powdered milk, cigarettes. Their mess halls were warm, their supplies seemingly endless. Just beyond the perimeter fences, German families huddled in basements and bombed-out apartments, subsisting on watery soup made from potato peels and whatever could be scavenged from the frozen ground. Private Daniel Hoffman, a 22-year-old farm boy from Iowa, had been stationed in Aachen since October. His letters home described a city that no longer resembled a city, more like a graveyard with people living in the tombs. He wrote about the children most often. "They don't cry anymore, Ma. They just stare. Their eyes follow every tin can we throw away, every cigarette butt we crush underfoot. It's like watching ghosts who haven't figured out they're dead yet." The military government's official policy was clear. Fraternization with German civilians was strictly prohibited. The reasoning was both practical and ideological. Germany had started the war, had perpetrated unspeakable atrocities, and now had to face the consequences of defeat. Sharing supplies with former enemies could undermine discipline and complicate the occupation. But policies written in Washington faced a different reality on the frozen streets of Aachen. Corporal James Mitchell, a medic from Philadelphia, kept a diary throughout his service. His entry from December 10, 1945, captured the growing tension. "Saw a girl today, maybe 8 years old, digging through our garbage. She found half a chocolate bar I'd thrown away and held it like it was made of gold. Her mother pulled her away, crying. Not the girl, the mother. The girl was too weak to cry. We're supposed to treat these people like the enemy, but all I see are hungry children who never chose this war." The psychological toll on American soldiers was compounding daily. Many had witnessed the liberation of concentration camps and had seen firsthand the horrors of the Nazi regime. Their hatred of what Germany had become was real and justified. But the children, they complicated everything. A 7-year-old girl with frostbitten fingers couldn't be held accountable for Dachau. A 10-year-old boy with rickets couldn't be blamed for the invasion of Poland. By mid-December, unofficial acts of mercy were becoming common. A soldier would accidentally leave his lunch near a fence where children gathered. Another would drop a can of beans while walking past a refugee shelter. These small rebellions against official policy were rarely discussed openly, but they were spreading through the ranks like a quiet epidemic of conscience. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a platoon leader from Boston, noticed the pattern. In a confidential report to his commanding officer, he wrote, "Morale remains high, but I'm observing behavior that technically violates non-fraternization orders. Men are finding ways to share food with civilian children. I recommend we address this situation before it becomes a disciplinary issue, though I must note that the humanitarian impulse driving this behavior reflects well on the character of our troops." The response from command was deliberately vague, a tacit acknowledgement that enforcing the letter of the law might break something more important than military discipline. As Christmas approached, the temperature dropped to -15 degrees Celsius. Snow covered the ruins, creating a false beauty that made the suffering beneath even more obscene. In the basement of a collapsed apartment building on Wilhelmstrasse, Anna Schneider huddled with her 3 children. Her husband had died in the Wehrmacht's final defense of Berlin. Her home had been destroyed in a bombing raid. She had watched her youngest son, Klaus, grow thinner each day, despite her desperate efforts to find food. On December 18th, she wrote in a tattered notebook, "Klaus asked me today why Christmas isn't coming this year. I told him Christmas is coming, but I don't know if I believe it anymore. The cold is inside us now, not just in our bodies, in our hearts." The stage was being set for something unprecedented. Christmas was 5 days away, and in the American compound, Sergeant William Patterson had begun organizing what he called a humanitarian operation, disguised as a morale event. The war had taught these men to destroy. Now they were about to learn whether they could still remember how to heal. The idea began not in an officers' meeting, but in a mess hall conversation that would ripple through the entire battalion. Sergeant William Patterson, a former schoolteacher from Tennessee, had been discussing Christmas plans with his squad when Private Eddie Torres mentioned something that stopped everyone mid-sentence. "My kid brother is 7 years old, same age as that German boy I saw yesterday trying to eat frozen grass near the supply depot." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. These men had children, younger siblings, nieces and nephews waiting for them back home. They had sent Christmas packages containing candy and small toys across the Atlantic. Yet here, within walking distance of their warm barracks, children were starving in the ruins of their former enemy's capital. Patterson set down his coffee and spoke carefully. "What if we organized a Christmas distribution, nothing official, just men voluntarily giving up part of their rations to help feed civilian children? One day, Christmas Eve." The table erupted in debate, some enthusiastic, others cautious about violating non-fraternization orders, all aware they were discussing something that could result in court-martial if mishandled. By the following morning, Patterson had drafted a proposal. It was deliberately framed not as charity to Germans, but as a morale-building activity for American troops. An organized distribution of surplus rations to prevent waste and allow soldiers to observe Christmas in accordance with their faith traditions. The language was bureaucratic enough to provide cover, yet clear enough in its intent that any officer reading it would understand exactly what was being proposed. Captain Richard Donovan received the proposal with the weary pragmatism of a man who had spent 2 years navigating the gap between military regulations and moral reality. He read it twice, then looked at Patterson with an expression that conveyed both caution and complicity. "If this happens, Sergeant, it happens through proper channels. I want documentation showing every can, every chocolate bar, every blanket came from voluntary donations. If command asks questions, we need to show this was soldiers exercising personal charity, not official policy." The operation began in secret. Patterson and a core group of 8 soldiers, Torres, Hoffman, Mitchell and 5 others, started quietly recruiting volunteers. The pitch was simple. Donate any part of your Christmas ration you're willing to spare. No pressure, no judgment for those who declined. The response exceeded all expectations. Within 3 days, they had collected enough food to feed 200 children. Canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate bars, dried fruit, crackers, even some precious sugar. Corporal James Mitchell, leveraging his medical connections, managed to procure wool blankets that had been designated for potential use but never formally distributed. Private Daniel Hoffman contributed something more valuable than food: information about where the neediest children could be found. Hoffman had been conducting unauthorized reconnaissance missions, walking through the civilian quarters during his off hours, noting which buildings housed families with young children. His handwritten map marked 17 locations with the highest concentrations of starving kids. It was intelligence gathering in service of mercy, a strange inversion of his military training. The planning became increasingly sophisticated. They established a distribution point in a partially intact church near the American sector boundary. Father Johann Weber, a German priest who had quietly opposed the Nazi regime and survived, agreed to help identify families most in need. His church had become a refuge for displaced civilians, and his quiet dignity had earned him respect, even from occupying forces who were supposed to maintain emotional distance. Torres took on the role of logistics coordinator, creating a system to pack individual ration bundles, each containing enough food to sustain a child for several days. He worked late into the night, assembling packages with the precision of a man who understood that every can of meat, every chocolate bar, represented the difference between hunger and sustenance for a child who had done nothing to deserve either war or its aftermath. But secrecy was becoming difficult to maintain. Word spread through the ranks, and soon soldiers from other platoons were asking how they could contribute. Some donated their entire Christmas ration. Others gave up cigarettes, currency more valuable than money in post-war Germany, so these could be traded for additional food from local suppliers willing to bypass official channels. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, who had earlier warned his superiors about unauthorized sharing, now found himself quietly facilitating the operation. He arranged for a supply truck to be misrouted for several hours on December 23rd, providing transportation to move the collected supplies to the church. He also ensured that military police patrols would be concentrated in other sectors during the planned distribution. The night before Christmas Eve, Patterson gathered his core team in the church basement. The space was cold, lit by candles Father Weber had somehow acquired. Boxes of food lined the walls, a hidden arsenal of mercy waiting to be deployed. "Tomorrow morning," Patterson said, "we do something that isn't in any military manual. We feed children whose fathers tried to kill us. We do it because they're children, and because if we don't, we become something worse than what we fought against." Private Hoffman, the Iowa farm boy, added something that would later appear in multiple soldiers' letters home. "My dad always said you judge a man not by how he treats his friends, but by how he treats those who can't do anything for him. These kids can't do anything for us. That's exactly why we have to do this." Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing to which places and at which moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. As midnight approached, light snow began to fall over Aachen. In the ruins, German families prepared for a Christmas without food, without heat, without hope. In the church basement, American soldiers prepared for a Christmas that would define them for the rest of their lives. The temperature continued to drop, but something warmer than winter's cold was about to break through the frozen silence of occupation. Dawn broke over Aachen on December 24, 1945, with a pale winter sun that provided light, but no warmth. The temperature hovered at -12 degrees Celsius, and fresh snow had transformed the rubble into a deceptive landscape of white peace. In the church basement, Sergeant Patterson and his team had been awake since 0400 hours, conducting final preparations for an operation that existed in the grey zone between official orders and humanitarian necessity. The plan was precise. Distribution would begin at 0900 hours and conclude by 1400 hours, a 5-hour window that coincided with a scheduled shift change among military police, providing maximum opportunity with minimum oversight. Father Weber had spread word through the civilian network. Families with children should come to the church's east entrance, quietly and in small groups. No crowds, no spectacle. Just hungry children receiving food from soldiers who had chosen conscience over policy. Private Torres had spent the night assembling individual ration packs. Each contained 1 can of meat, 1 chocolate bar, powdered milk, crackers, and dried fruit. Approximately 2,400 calories, enough to sustain a child for 3 days if rationed carefully. He had also included small additions that transformed practical supplies into Christmas gifts: a stick of gum, a few hard candies, a hand-drawn Christmas card created by soldiers who couldn't draw but tried anyway. At 08:45 hours, the first family arrived. Anna Schneider, the widow from Wilhelmstrasse, led her 3 children through the snow. Her youngest son, Klaus, could barely walk from weakness and cold. She approached the church entrance with the posture of someone expecting rejection, perhaps even punishment for accepting help from occupiers. Instead, she found Private Hoffman waiting with a smile that cut through months of fear and suspicion. Hoffman knelt to Klaus's eye level, a gesture of respect that shocked Anna more than any act of charity could. "Frohe Weihnachten," he said in careful German. "Merry Christmas." His accent was terrible, but his intent was clear. He handed Klaus a ration pack, then added something that wasn't part of any official distribution. A small wooden toy soldier he had carved during night watches, its uniform painted to look American rather than German, a symbol of protection rather than threat. Klaus stared at the toy, then at the food, then at his mother, Anna Schneider, who had not cried when her husband died, who had not cried when her home was destroyed, who had not cried through months of starvation and cold, began to weep. Not quiet tears, but the deep, convulsive sobs of someone whose capacity for grief had finally exceeded her capacity to contain it. "Danke," she whispered. "Danke. Gott segne dich. God bless you." Hoffmann felt something break inside his chest. Not unpleasantly, but definitively. Later, in a letter to his mother, he would write, "I finally understand what we were fighting for, not against Germany, for the world where children don't starve because of decisions made by men in power. I don't know if that world exists, Ma, but for 5 hours today, we pretended it did. By 1,000 hours, the distribution had developed its own rhythm. Families arrived in small groups, guided by Father Weber, who knew each family's story and level of need. Some mothers came alone, their husbands dead or missing in the war's final campaigns. Some grandparents came carrying infants, their own children killed in bombing raids. Each received the same basic ration, but soldiers began adding personal touches: an extra blanket for twins, additional milk for a nursing mother, more chocolate for a child celebrating a birthday. Corporal Mitchell, the medic from Philadelphia, found himself performing impromptu medical assessments. He noted cases of severe malnutrition, frostbite, rickets caused by vitamin D deficiency. He distributed what medical supplies he could spare: vitamins, bandages, antiseptic ointment. He also kept careful records, documenting conditions that official reports minimized or ignored. His notes would later contribute to policy changes regarding civilian welfare in occupied zones. The emotional toll on American soldiers was immediate and profound. These young men had been trained to view Germans as the enemy, an abstraction that made military operations psychologically manageable. But abstractions dissolved when faced with a 7-year-old girl named Greta, who reminded Private Torres of his niece in San Antonio. Abstractions evaporated when an elderly woman kissed Sergeant Patterson's hand while whispering prayers in German he couldn't understand but felt in his core. Lieutenant Hayes, observing from a discreet distance, realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in military history. Armies had occupied defeated territories before. Conquerors had imposed their will on civilian populations for millennia. But this, soldiers voluntarily surrendering their own rations to feed the children of their recent enemies, this represented something fundamentally different. It was occupation redefined as reconciliation, victory tempered by mercy. Around 11:30 hours, an incident occurred that would become legendary within the battalion. An elderly German man named Friedrich Meyer approached the distribution line with his grandson, a boy of 9 whose father had died at Stalingrad. Friedrich had been a professor of philosophy before the war, and he carried himself with a dignity that poverty and defeat could not erase. When offered a ration pack, he hesitated, then spoke in careful English. "Why do you do this? We are your enemies. We brought this suffering upon ourselves. Sergeant Patterson responded with words that multiple soldiers would later quote in their letters and memoirs. "Your government was our enemy. Your army was our enemy. This boy right here," he gestured to the grandson, "he's not my enemy. He's just a hungry kid on Christmas Eve. If that's not reason enough, then I don't know what we've been fighting for." Friedrich Meyer stood silent for a long moment, tears forming in eyes that had seen the rise and fall of the Third Reich, the destruction of everything he had known. Then he did something that violated every instinct of pride and national identity. He embraced Patterson with the desperation of a man who had lost faith in humanity and suddenly found reason to reclaim it. "Vergib uns," he whispered. "Forgive us." The distribution continued through early afternoon. By 1400 hours, they had fed 183 children and provided supplies for 67 families. The stockpile of donated rations had been exhausted. The church basement, which had been full of boxes that morning, now held only empty cartons and the lingering smell of chocolate and canned meat, ordinary scents transformed into sacred evidence of human kindness overcoming historical hatred. As families dispersed back into the ruins, many carried more than food. They carried proof that enemies could choose mercy, that soldiers could prioritize children over politics, that even in the darkest winter, humanity could generate its own warmth. Klaus Schneider would later tell his own children that Christmas 1945 was the day he learned that kindness didn't require a common language, only a common recognition of suffering. The American soldiers, exhausted and emotionally spent, gathered in the church to debrief. No one spoke for several minutes. Finally, Private Torres broke the silence with an observation that captured what they had all been feeling. "We just committed the most beautiful act of insubordination in military history." Father Weber, who had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature throughout the war years, added his own benediction. "You came to Germany as conquerors. Today you left as brothers. That is the miracle of Christmas. Not the virgin birth, but the daily choice to see divinity in the suffering of strangers." As the sun set over Aachen, casting long shadows across the snow-covered rubble, something had fundamentally shifted. The war had ended in May, but the peace, the real peace, had perhaps begun on this frozen December afternoon, in the exchange of food between former enemies who discovered they shared a more fundamental identity. Membership in the human family, where children's hunger transcends national borders and historical grievances. The compound's secret was no longer a secret, but by then it didn't matter. What had begun as a covert operation to circumvent official policy had become a moral precedent that would influence occupation policy throughout Germany. Sometimes disobedience isn't a failure of discipline, it's a success of conscience. The immediate consequences of the Christmas Eve distribution arrived with the precision of military bureaucracy. By December 26th, Captain Donovan was summoned to battalion headquarters to explain reports of unauthorized distribution of military supplies to civilian populations in violation of non-fraternization protocols. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. No formal charges were filed. The official record would note only irregular but well-intentioned morale activities conducted by enlisted personnel during holiday period. What the official record didn't capture was the seismic shift occurring throughout the American occupation forces. Word of the Aachen distribution spread through military channels with the speed of combat intelligence. Soldiers in other sectors began asking why similar operations couldn't be organized in their areas. Chaplains reported increased attendance at religious services, with men seeking moral guidance about their roles as both conquerors and potential helpers. The psychological contradiction of occupation, maintaining authority over people you were simultaneously trying to rehabilitate, was becoming impossible to ignore. Sergeant Patterson found himself promoted to an unofficial position that existed nowhere in military hierarchy, liaison between military authorities and civilian welfare initiatives. His special assignment involved coordinating food distributions, identifying families in acute need, and serving as a bridge between two populations that official policy insisted should remain separate. It was diplomacy disguised as logistics, reconciliation masqueraded as supply management. The German civilian response was equally complex. Anna Schneider, the widow who had received the first ration pack, became an informal organizer within the civilian community. She compiled lists of families with young children, verified cases of extreme need, and ensured that subsequent distributions reached those most desperate. Her motivations were practical, but also psychological. Helping others gave her purpose beyond mere survival, transformed her from victim to agent, from recipient to coordinator. Her son Klaus, the 7-year-old who had received the wooden soldier from Private Hoffman, kept the toy with religious devotion. He slept with it, talked to it, treated it as a talisman against hunger and cold. In the symbolism of a child's mind, the American soldier figurine represented safety rather than threat, protection rather than conquest. His mother watched this transformation with mixed emotions, gratitude for the mercy shown, but also awareness that her son's psychological survival was now partially dependent on the kindness of foreign soldiers. Throughout January 1946, additional distributions occurred with increasing official sanction. What had begun as covert charity evolved into semi-official policy. The military government established civilian welfare stations where German families could receive supplemental rations. The criteria were deliberately vague: extreme hardship with dependent children, allowing soldiers significant discretion in determining eligibility. Private Hoffman continued his unauthorized walking tours through civilian areas, but now his observations were officially documented. His reports provided intelligence not about military threats, but about human suffering. Building 47, Kaiserstrasse. Widow with 4 children, youngest 18 months old. No heat source. Children showing signs of advanced malnutrition. Recommend priority intervention. These reports created an unexpected feedback loop. As American soldiers became more aware of civilian conditions, their willingness to share resources increased. As German civilians received help, their hostility toward occupiers decreased, making the occupation itself more manageable. Mercy, it turned out, was not just morally preferable to harshness, it was strategically more effective. Corporal Mitchell, the medic, expanded his role beyond immediate medical care. He began documenting the long-term health consequences of starvation and displacement, creating what would become one of the most comprehensive medical records of civilian suffering in post-war Germany. His meticulously maintained journals noted not just physical conditions, but psychological states. Mother of 3, age 31, appears 50. Describes constant anxiety about children's survival, shows symptoms of what military psychiatrists call combat fatigue, but she never fought in combat. The war's violence extended far beyond battlefields. Mitchell's work would later contribute to academic understanding of civilian trauma in occupied territories, but in the moment, it was simply the diary of a young man trying to reconcile his medical training with the inadequacy of resources to address the suffering he witnessed daily. He wrote frequent letters to his former professors at Temple University, describing conditions and asking for guidance. None of his professors had answers. The scale of humanitarian crisis in post-war Europe exceeded anything medical training had prepared them for. Lieutenant Hayes, meanwhile, navigated the complex politics of occupation with increasing sophistication. He learned which superior officers prioritized strict adherence to policy and which were willing to tolerate creative interpretations of regulations. He became expert at framing humanitarian initiatives in language that emphasized military objectives. Feeding children wasn't charity, it was stability operations to reduce civil unrest. Providing blankets wasn't kindness, it was disease prevention to protect troop health. This bureaucratic translation of mercy into military necessity was cynical in method but sincere in intent. Hayes understood that systemic change required working within systems, even when those systems were inadequate to the moral demands of the situation. His after-action reports became masterclasses in how to embed humanitarian priorities within military frameworks, recommend expansion of supplemental feeding programs for civilian dependents as a force protection measure. Populations with adequate nutrition demonstrate reduced hostility toward occupation forces, improving overall security posture. By February 1946, the Christmas Eve distribution had catalyzed changes far beyond Aachen. Other units throughout the American occupation zone were implementing similar programs. The British and French zones, initially more punitive in their occupation policies, began questioning whether their approaches were both morally defensible and practically effective. The Soviet zone, by contrast, maintained strict separation between occupiers and civilians, using starvation as a tool of political control, a divergence that foreshadowed the Cold War divisions to come. The psychological impact on American soldiers was profound and lasting. Men who had viewed their military service primarily through the lens of combat and victory began redefining what it meant to serve. Private Torres wrote to his family in San Antonio, "We beat Germany in battle, but that was the easy part. The hard part is figuring out how to help them rebuild without losing sight of why we fought them in the first place. Every time I hand a ration pack to a German kid, I think about the concentration camps. Then I think about how punishing children for their parents' crimes makes us no better than what we fought against." This moral complexity, the simultaneous awareness of German atrocities and German suffering, created a generation of veterans who understood that justice and mercy weren't opposites, but necessarily interconnected. They had seen the death camps and the starving children, the Nazi rallies and the bombed-out homes. They carried these contradictions for the rest of their lives, and many would later say that learning to hold both realities simultaneously was the most difficult and most important lesson of the war. The German civilian population, meanwhile, grappled with its own contradictions. Gratitude for American help coexisted with shame about national guilt, relief at receiving food mixed with humiliation at dependence on former enemies. Anna Schneider articulated this in a diary entry from February 1946. "We are grateful and ashamed in equal measure. The Americans feed our children while our government built gas chambers. How do we accept their kindness without forgetting our collective sin? How do we feed our children without losing our moral reckoning with what we allowed to happen?" If this story surprised you, go ahead and leave a like to help the channel. These questions had no easy answers. The food distributions continued, the children survived, and slowly, very slowly, something resembling normal life began to emerge from the ruins. But the moral complexity of that winter would haunt both Germans and Americans for decades. Mercy had been extended, suffering had been alleviated. Yet the deeper questions about guilt, responsibility, and reconciliation remained unresolved, waiting for future generations to grapple with the implications of kindness exchanged between enemies in the frozen winter of 1945. The correspondence between soldiers in occupied Germany and their families in America provides the most intimate record of the psychological transformation occurring in the winter of 1946. These letters, written on thin military stationery, often by candlelight in cold barracks, reveal men trying to explain experiences that transcended their capacity for explanation. They documented not just what happened, but what it meant to happen. Not just actions taken, but identity altered. Private Daniel Hoffman wrote to his mother in Iowa on January 15, 1946, in his characteristically straightforward style. "Dear Ma, I need to tell you about something that's been weighing on my mind. Remember how I used to write about hating Germans? how I said they all deserved what they got. I still believe the Nazi leaders should hang, but Ma, the kids here, they're just kids. I met a boy named Klaus who reminds me of cousin Tommy. Same age, same way of looking at you when he's hungry but too proud to ask. His father died fighting for Hitler, but Klaus never chose that. He was just born in the wrong place at the wrong time. We've been sharing food with families like his. Command doesn't exactly approve, but they don't exactly stop us either. I think what I'm learning is that hating evil is necessary, but extending that hate to everyone connected to evil just creates more evil. It's complicated, Ma. War was simpler when it was just about shooting at people shooting at you. Corporal James Mitchell, the medic from Philadelphia, wrote more analytically to his former professor. Dr. Richardson, I find myself conducting an unintended study on the physiology of starvation in civilian populations. The children here show textbook signs of severe malnutrition, edema, muscle wasting, developmental delays, psychological withdrawal. But the medical reality exists alongside a moral crisis I wasn't trained to handle. I can diagnose rickets, but how do I diagnose the ethical implications of having abundant resources while children starve 50 yards away? Medical school taught me to, first, do no harm, but the Hippocratic Oath doesn't address what to do when harm is policy. We're sharing what we can, but it feels like bailing out the ocean with a teaspoon. The scale of need exceeds our capacity to help, yet doing nothing would be worse than inadequate action. I'm learning that medicine in war isn't about perfect solutions. It's about imperfect mercy extended despite systemic limitations. Private Eddie Torres wrote to his younger brother with the blunt honesty of siblings. Little brother, you asked what it's like to be in the army. Most of it's boring, guard duty, paperwork, waiting around. But sometimes you face situations they don't train you for. Like, do you share your food with hungry enemy kids when regulations say don't fraternize? We decided yes, and I'd make the same choice again. But here's what's weird. The German kids look at us like we're heroes for doing the bare minimum decent thing. Like feeding a hungry child on Christmas is somehow extraordinary instead of just basic humanity. It makes me wonder what kind of world we're creating where mercy is exceptional rather than expected. When you get older and face hard choices, remember this. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the prohibited thing to do. Choose right over permitted. Sergeant William Patterson, whose leadership had initiated the Christmas distribution, wrote to his wife with the reflective tone of a former teacher, "Dearest Margaret, I've been thinking about what we teach children about morality. We tell them to be kind, to share, to help those in need. Simple lessons for young minds. But what happens when those lessons conflict with other values we also teach? Obedience to authority, loyalty to country, suspicion of enemies. I'm watching good men struggle with this contradiction daily. They want to follow orders and help starving children, and sometimes those desires are incompatible. We're creating an unofficial policy of strategic disobedience, breaking rules in service of higher principles. It's messy and legally questionable, but morally I believe we're on solid ground. The question I keep returning to, if following orders means letting children starve, whose conscience do we protect, our own or our commanders? I think you know my answer. Lieutenant Robert Hayes wrote the most politically astute letters, carefully crafted to avoid censorship while documenting policy evolution. Father, as a former State Department official, you'll appreciate the diplomatic complexity of occupation. We're simultaneously punishing Germany for its crimes while trying to prevent conditions that could foster future extremism. It's a delicate balance. The Christmas distribution I mentioned in my last letter has evolved into broader policy shifts. We're discovering that mercy isn't weakness. It's strategic investment in long-term stability. The children we feed today are the adults who will shape Germany's future. If they remember American occupation as cruel and punitive, we plant seeds for future conflict. If they remember acts of unexpected kindness, we create possibility for genuine reconciliation. War teaches men to destroy. The harder lesson is learning how to build. The responses from home were equally revealing. Hoffman's mother wrote back with maternal wisdom, "Danny, your heart's in the right place. Remember the parable of the Good Samaritan. The point wasn't that the injured man was Jewish or Samaritan. It was that he was suffering, and someone chose to help despite their differences. You're being a good Samaritan, son. I'm proud of you." Mitchell's professor responded with academic encouragement. "James, you're documenting important data. Keep detailed records. This information will be valuable for understanding civilian health crises in future conflicts. But more importantly, you're learning that medicine is inseparable from ethics. Every clinical decision is also a moral decision. Your willingness to act despite uncertainty demonstrates maturity that many physicians never develop." Torres's brother sent a reply that captured youthful idealism. "Eddie, you're my hero. Not because you fought. Lots of guys fought. Because you chose to help when you didn't have to. That takes a different kind of courage." These letters circulated beyond their immediate recipients. Families shared them with neighbors, local newspapers printed excerpts, churches read them during services. The story of American soldiers feeding German children on Christmas Eve resonated through American society because it confirmed a narrative Americans wanted to believe about themselves, that they were not just militarily superior, but morally superior, not just victorious, but virtuous. Yet the soldiers themselves were more ambivalent. They understood their actions were both genuinely altruistic and strategically beneficial, both spontaneously humanitarian and carefully calculated. Private Torres wrote in February, "We're good guys doing a good thing, but we're also occupying conquerors, making ourselves feel better about conquering. Both things are true. I don't know how to hold both truths simultaneously, but I'm learning that's what adulthood means, accepting complexity without needing simple answers." The correspondence also revealed growing tensions within military hierarchy. Some commanders viewed the food distributions as dangerous precedent that undermined discipline. One captain wrote to his battalion commander, "If we allow soldiers to pick and choose which orders to follow based on personal moral judgment, we sacrifice the chain of command that makes military effectiveness possible. Today, they share rations with children. Tomorrow, they refuse combat orders because they've decided that particular battle is unjust. Discipline requires consistency." Other officers defended the distributions as embodying American values. A chaplain wrote, "We didn't fight this war to become like our enemies. We fought to preserve human dignity and democratic ideals. If we win the war but lose our humanity in the process, what exactly have we won?" These young men are showing more strategic wisdom than some of their superiors. They understand that winning the war and winning the peace require different approaches. By March 1946, the volume of correspondence about civilian welfare had become so substantial that military censors flagged it as a potential security issue. Not because soldiers were revealing classified information, but because the letters documented a disconnect between official policy and ground-level reality. The military government in Germany was, according to official statements, maintaining strict separation between occupiers and occupied. The letters revealed something entirely different: a vast network of informal relationships, mutual assistance, and tentative reconciliation. This documentation would prove historically significant. Decades later, when historians analyzed the success of post-war German reconstruction, many would point to these early months of occupation as foundational. The Marshall Plan provided economic resources, but the personal connections forged between individual soldiers and German families created the psychological foundation for broader reconciliation. Trust it turned out, began not with political treaties, but with simple acts witnessed by children who never forgot. Klaus Schneider, the boy who received the wooden soldier on Christmas Eve 1945, kept that toy for 70 years. When he died in 2015, it was buried with him, a small piece of painted wood that represented the moment when enemies chose to become helpers, when soldiers remembered they were human beings first and conquerors second, when mercy triumphed over vengeance in the frozen ruins of a defeated nation. The letters from that winter tell this story better than any official history could. They capture not just what happened, but what it felt like to happen. The confusion, the conviction, the complexity of choosing kindness in a context designed for cruelty. They document a moment when young men, barely adults themselves, decided that feeding hungry children mattered more than following regulations that prohibited exactly that kind of human decency. The consequences of the Aachen distribution extended far beyond the immediate relief provided to 183 children on Christmas Eve. By spring 1946, what had begun as an isolated act of compassion had metastasized into a broader reconsideration of occupation policy across the American zone. In March 1946, General Lucius Clay, Deputy Military Governor of the American Occupation Zone, issued Directive 47, which established civilian welfare stations throughout American-occupied Germany, authorized to distribute supplemental rations to families with dependent children who could demonstrate acute need. The directive didn't mention the Christmas distribution by name, but its timing and provisions made the connection obvious. Lieutenant Hayes, who had helped draft recommendations that influenced the directive, later wrote, "Sometimes policy follows practice rather than preceding it. The soldiers on the ground were already doing what headquarters eventually decided was correct. Our job was to provide bureaucratic cover for actions that were occurring regardless of official sanction." The implementation created immediate logistical challenges. How do you determine acute need in a country where nearly everyone is suffering? Sergeant Patterson relied on a network of German civilians, teachers, priests, community leaders who knew their neighborhoods intimately. Anna Schneider became his most reliable contact, maintaining lists of families and verifying claims of need. The German civilian response was complex. Many families were grateful beyond expression. The supplemental rations literally meant the difference between survival and starvation. Others felt humiliated by dependence on foreign charity. Friedrich Meyer, the philosophy professor, articulated this ambivalence in a letter. "The Americans feed our children while occupying our country. They show mercy while maintaining dominance. I accept their help because my grandson must eat, but I struggle with what this acceptance means for German dignity." By summer 1946, the success of welfare stations in the American zone created pressure on British and French occupation authorities to implement similar programs. The contrast was becoming politically embarrassing. The British eventually established their own welfare program in August 1946. The French maintained more punitive policies through 1947. The Soviet sector used food access as a tool of political control. This divergence foreshadowed the ideological divisions that would soon split Germany for 44 years. Corporal Mitchell's medical documentation showed measurable improvements by mid-1946. Rates of severe malnutrition among children declined in areas with active welfare stations. Cases of rickets and deficiency diseases decreased. Infant mortality began to normalize. But Mitchell also documented something less quantifiable: the psychological impact of hope restored. Families who had been subsisting in survival mode began planning for futures beyond the next meal. The impact on German society was generational. Children who received food from American soldiers in 1945-1946 grew up with complicated feelings about America, gratitude mixed with awareness of power dynamics. Klaus Schneider became a teacher in the 1960s, often telling his students about Christmas 1945, framing it as a lesson about the possibility of choosing humanity over hatred, even in contexts designed to reinforce divisions. The broader strategic implications became apparent over subsequent years. While the Marshall Plan provided economic resources, many historians argue that the psychological foundation for recovery was laid earlier, in small acts of mercy extended during the darkest period of occupation. Children who remembered American soldiers as helpers, rather than purely as conquerors, were more receptive to democratic ideals. By 1947, the welfare stations were being phased out as German economic recovery accelerated. But the impact persisted. Relationships formed between individual soldiers and German families continued through correspondence. Some Americans sponsored German families' immigration. A few soldiers returned to Germany to marry women they had met during occupation. If this story surprised you, go ahead and leave a like to help the channel. The story entered American cultural memory as evidence of national virtue, proof that Americans were capable of transcending vengeance to embrace reconciliation. Sergeant Patterson received no official recognition for his role. There was no medal for strategic disobedience. He returned to Tennessee in 1947, resumed teaching, and rarely spoke about his military service, except to say that the most important thing he learned in the war was that following your conscience sometimes requires ignoring your orders. Private Hoffman returned to Iowa, took over his family's farm, and lived quietly. But he kept every letter from Anna Schneider and Klaus, and in his final years told his grandchildren about the winter he learned that being a good soldier sometimes meant being a bad rule follower. His wooden toy soldier, the twin of the one he had given to Klaus, sat on his desk until he died. A reminder that mercy extended across enemy lines had changed not just the recipients, but the giver as well. 70 years after Private Daniel Hoffman carved a wooden soldier by candlelight in a cold German winter, that toy was buried with Klaus Schneider in a cemetery outside Munich. The obituary mentioned it briefly. Schneider is survived by his 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and the small American figurine he carried throughout his life as a reminder that even enemies can choose mercy. This is how history becomes memory. Not through official records and policy documents, but through objects carried across decades, stories told to grandchildren, lessons extracted from moments when humanity transcended hatred. The Christmas distribution of 1945 left no military monuments, earned no campaign medals, generated no official commemoration, yet it persisted in collective memory. The soldiers who participated returned to America and resumed civilian lives. They became teachers, farmers, doctors, businessmen, ordinary people who had done an extraordinary thing in extraordinary circumstances. When they spoke about their service, usually late in life, they returned consistently to that frozen Christmas Eve in Aachen. Sergeant William Patterson, in an oral history interview conducted in 1987, reflected, "I've had 40 years to think about what we did that winter. Some people say we were heroes. Others say we violated military discipline. I think we were just young men who realized that following bad rules makes you complicit in badness. We didn't end the war. We didn't rebuild Germany. We just fed some hungry kids on Christmas. But maybe that's enough. Maybe changing the world doesn't require grand gestures. Maybe it just requires doing the obvious decent thing when systems tell you not to." Anna Schneider maintained correspondence with several soldiers until her death in 1982. Her letters mixed gratitude with honesty about complicated emotions. In 1968, she wrote to Corporal Mitchell, "You saved my children's lives that winter. I will never forget your kindness. But I also cannot forget that American bombs killed my husband and destroyed our home. Both things are true. I hold both truths. Perhaps that is what reconciliation means. Not forgetting the harm, but choosing not to let harm define the entirety of relationship." This capacity to hold multiple truths simultaneously, gratitude and grief, Mercy and memory, forgiveness without forgetting, became characteristic of the German generation that experienced occupation as children. They grew up understanding that historical relationships could be more nuanced than simple friend-enemy dichotomies. In 1995, 50 years after the Christmas distribution, a small ceremony was held in Aachen. 4 surviving American veterans, including Hoffman and Torres, attended, along with 17 German civilians who had received food as children. The ceremony was unofficial, organized by local historians. There were no speeches by politicians, no military bands, no formal recognition. Just elderly men and women sharing memories of a desperate winter when enemies chose to feed each other's children. Klaus Schneider, then 67, spoke briefly. "I don't remember being hungry, though I know I was. I don't remember the cold, though I know I nearly died from it. What I remember is the American soldier who knelt to my level and handed me a toy. That gesture, looking me in the eye, treating me as a child worthy of kindness rather than as an enemy to be punished, that changed everything. It taught me that identity is choice, not destiny, that we can be more than our nation's crimes. That mercy is always possible even between enemies." Private Hoffman, listening, wept openly. He had carried guilt for decades, guilt about the bombing campaigns that killed German civilians, guilt about the inadequacy of the help provided, guilt about returning to comfort while Germans remained in ruins. Seeing Klaus alive, healthy, surrounded by family, teaching the next generation about choosing humanity over hatred, it offered something he hadn't known he needed. Evidence that small acts matter, that imperfect mercy is better than perfect indifference, that feeding one hungry child doesn't solve systemic problems, but changes that child's world completely. The institutional legacy proved equally significant. The Geneva Conventions, expanded in 1949, included provisions protecting civilian populations in occupied territories, requirements to provide adequate food, medical care, and shelter. These legal frameworks reflected lessons learned in post-war Germany, that occupying powers have responsibilities beyond military control, that civilian welfare affects strategic outcomes, that treating defeated populations with dignity serves long-term interests. When the United States conducted subsequent military operations, planners cited the German occupation as a model, though application remained imperfect and context-dependent. The lesson learned in Aachen, that mercy towards civilian populations improves long-term stability, became military orthodoxy even when execution failed to match principle. The story of the Christmas distribution entered military academies as a case study in ethical leadership. Young officers studied Sergeant Patterson's decision to prioritize conscience over regulations, Lieutenant Hayes's skill at framing humanitarian initiatives in military language, Private Hoffman's capacity to see individual humanity beneath collective guilt. These men hadn't been extraordinary by conventional military standards. They hadn't led dramatic charges or executed brilliant tactics. They had simply chosen to feed hungry children when policy said not to. That choice echoed across decades. The children who received food in 1945 became the adults who rebuilt Germany, who embraced democracy, who worked toward European integration, who ensured their nation would never again pursue aggressive war. Not all of them, certainly. Individual experiences don't determine collective outcomes, that's simply. But enough of them, in enough ways, to matter. By 2015, when Klaus Schneider died, only 2 of the American soldiers who had distributed rations on Christmas Eve 1945 were still alive. Private Torres, 92, attended the funeral in Munich. He stood at the graveside, watching the wooden soldier being placed in the coffin, and spoke to no one in particular. "We thought we were just feeding kids. Turns out we were planting seeds. Took 70 years to see what grew from them." Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of the soldiers and civilians who chose mercy over vengeance in the frozen winter of 1945. See you in the next video. The war had ended in fire and steel, in mushroom clouds and signing ceremonies, in victory parades and rubble-strewn streets. But the peace, the real peace, had begun more quietly, in the exchange of food between enemies who discovered they were also human beings, in the choice to see children as children rather than extensions of their parents' crimes, in the wooden soldier carved by a farm boy from Iowa and carried for 70 years by a German teacher who never forgot that mercy, once extended, changes both the giver and receiver forever. The war taught men to destroy. The peace taught them something harder, that building requires more courage than destroying, that mercy demands more strength than vengeance, that the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the hatred within ourselves. Those lessons, learned in the frozen ruins of Aachen in the winter of 1945, remain urgent today. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, we retain the capacity to choose light over darkness, kindness over cruelty, hope over despair. The steel has long since rusted, the tanks have been scrapped, the bombers dismantled, but the wooden soldier endures in memory, not the physical object now buried in Munich, but what it represented. Proof that war's machinery cannot fully destroy the human impulse toward compassion, that even enemies can recognize each other's humanity, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply feeding a hungry child when authority says not to. That is the legacy of Christmas Eve 1945. Not a story of heroes and villains, but of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and choosing, imperfectly but genuinely, to extend mercy across the deepest divides of history, language, and enmity. The choice echoes still, waiting for each generation to decide whether to amplify or silence its call.